an op-ed by our speakers in the Denver Post yesterday. If you didn't get a chance to see it, it's linked to our website. In November 2013, the U.S. and 6 other countries agreed with Iran on an interim 6-month accord, and as you saw yesterday in the papers, that accord is going forward, and it will go into effect on January 20th. A lot of hope about that accord, a lot of concerns about that accord, and no one, I believe, is actually prepared to predict exactly how all of this will come out, except I do think we all agree that what is at stake is enormously important. Our speakers, whom I'll introduce here just in a second, Ambassador Pickering and Dr. Jim Walsh, are here under the auspices of the Foundation for Civil Society's Iran Project, and I want to welcome their Deputy Director, Iris Bieri, and thank you for your partnership over the last several months as we've put this program together. Ambassador Pickering is always legendary in the Foreign Service. I'm an old guy and I've known his name for a long time. He holds the rank of Career Ambassador, which is the highest in the American Foreign Service. His diplomatic career has spanned 5 decades. He was U.S. Ambassador to a number of countries, none of them terribly important: Israel, Russia, India, El Salvador, Nigeria, Jordan. And I said, as I mentioned, he was from U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations from 1989 to 1992, then served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. And he was Special Assistant to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Special Assistant to Secretary of State William Rogers, a veteran of the United States Navy and the Naval Reserves, and out here in Colorado, we'll just forgive you for that. No, thank you for that. He's joined by Dr. Jim Walsh, also active in the Iran Project with FCS. He's an expert in international security and a research associate at MIT's Security Studies program. He's written extensively about international security and nuclear issues. He's testified before the U.S. Senate on nuclear terrorism and about Iran's program. He is one of a handful of Americans who's traveled to both Iran and North Korea for talks with with officials about nuclear issues. Formerly, he was executive director of the Managing the Atom Project at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and he's taught at both Harvard and MIT. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to turn the podium over to first Ambassador Pickering, who will speak from here, and Dr. Walsh, who will speak from here, and then we'll move into a Q&A section, which I'll moderate from here, and they'll be here. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Pickering and Dr. Jim Walsh.
Thank you, Sky, very much for your very generous and indeed even a little hyperbolic introduction, which Jim and I enjoyed very much, and for which we thank you and all of you who attend most sincerely for being here today. Just by brief note of introduction, you were kind enough to mention the Iran Project. What is the Iran Project? Well, on your table there's a leaflet, at least one leaflet on each table, which tells you about the Iran Project. Simply, it began some 13 years ago, led by Bill Lewis in the Maine, who was then president of the United Nations Association of the United States. And it began with a series of track 2 conversations between Americans and Iranians, and then evolved over a period of time to a group of Americans that were particularly interested in seeing if we could help find a way both to open discussions on the official level between the United States and Iran, but even more important, if we could help make some sense out of where they might go. We have submitted ideas. We have talked extensively. We're spending a lot of our time on Capitol Hill, particularly with the Senate. We'll explain that too in a minute. We have also issued, over a period of years, a number of monographs, one on the costs and benefits of the use of military force about 1.5 or 2 years ago, when it looked like we were about to run down that old Iraq trail. shoot first, think later. And that particular monograph, I think, has had a significant influence on the thinking side of where we are. It was a monograph very unique in Washington because it was produced without a recommendation. We had the good grace to believe that readers themselves could figure out the answers without our help. And indeed they did. We did a second one on the costs and benefits of sanctions, which have played a very important role, as you will hear. And a third one on approaching the question of a negotiation with Iran from the diplomatic perspective. These, I believe, have helped, and we believe, in fact, that at this particular instance, our focus ought to be on helping people in the United States understand something about Iran, and particularly the nuclear portion of Iran. And so that's what we'll talk about today. I'm very pleased that I come to you within 24 hours of an announcement about what I would call the second milestone in the process of moving together with the Iranians on the issue of their nuclear program, which has caused us so much difficulty and so much uncertainty. Yesterday, the President and Secretary Kerry both took note of the fact that the agreement which had to be worked out to implement the joint program of action arrived at between Iran and the 5 Western negotiating partners. They're not really all Western: Russia, China, France, Britain, Germany, and the United States, to find a first stage effort to put restrictions on Iran's program in response to a willingness to help begin to loosen sanctions on the part of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council and Germany on the other side. I want to do just one or two things in my portion of the talk. I want to talk a little bit about some of the history, because some of the history is important to understand where we have come. I want to talk a little bit about some of how that has been shaped in a strategic sense. And then I want to talk a little bit about the dangers that lie ahead. And there are a number, but one in particular that I think it is important to bring to your attention. Jim Walsh, who I think, Sky, if you failed to mention, is a physicist, although he keeps it constantly before us, as he indeed makes sure that we make no errors of any scientific character, at least in our presentations. Jim will talk to you about the agreement of November, the implementation arrangement, and some of the problems and difficulties in legislation now pending before the Senate from a technical as well as from a tactical point of view in terms of where things are going. So let me just go back a few years. The Shah was in power. He wanted a nuclear program. The United States was willing to help. The program began rapidly. It evolved. At one point, the Shah wanted to buy some 20 nuclear power reactors. He was overthrown in a revolution. And indeed, the revolutionaries, from their own perspective, seemingly did not want a nuclear program. And in fact, that program died out. There ensued an 8-year war between Iraq and Iran in the 1980s, at the end of which, both as a result, I think, of the use of weapons of mass destruction in that war by Iraq against Iran and indeed against some of its own Iraqi population, and indeed because of a growing interest on the part of Iraq in nuclear weapons, Iran began again its nuclear program. Its program was presented as one devoted to peaceful pursuits. Everybody starts that way, but evolved over a period of time in ways that began to become a little unnerving. Perhaps most saliently in the late 90s and the early part of the last decade, Iran, through cooperation in part with the famous A.Q. Khan of Pakistan, the developer of the Pakistani bomb, began to achieve importation of technology and equipment, among other things, as well as continued with their own domestic development program in ways that made us even more nervous and concerned that the program was, at least in part, directed toward nuclear weapons. By 2003, in part as a result of negotiations, and in part perhaps as a reaction of Iran to our own role in the Middle East and in Iraq, the Iranians seemingly abandoned a portion, if not all, of their military endeavors at that time, but continued to develop, particularly enrichment, a process of raising the amount of fissile material in a mixture of uranium that would, on the one hand, provide the basic fuel for a nuclear power program, but on the other hand, with the acquisition of the appropriate technology, permit Iran to take that fuel to much higher levels of enrichment as the basis perhaps for a weapons program. So the concern about the weapons program has remained over a long period of time. Throughout the last decade, negotiations have been tried off and on, principally first beginning with the Europeans and then adding the Russians and the Chinese, and finally at the end of the Bush administration, the United States. Those negotiations seemingly followed a sterile and very unproductive pattern. The negotiations would consume much time in figuring out what the date of the next meeting would be and where it would be located. The meeting would be held. One side or the other would make a proposal. The proposal would be rejected by the other side, and we would be back into the year's cycle of first trying to organize the meeting and then rejecting the views of the other side. It was discouraging and indeed worse. Over a period of time, efforts were made to see whether, in fact, a process could begin which would take the particular efforts on the part of the negotiators in some direction. There were numerous roadblocks in the process. In the autumn of last year, we saw a very important breakthrough in elections held in Iran for a new president to replace the infamous President Ahmadinejad. A gentleman ran with long experience both in the nuclear program and in Iranian politics, a moderate and a reformer from his own record in the main. Mr. Rouhani won the election on the first round to the surprise of many people, and since that time has led an effort on the Iranian side both to open negotiations with the United States and with the P5+1, but also to try to make achievements in where that process would go. We now know that as early as March of 2012, quiet and indeed confidential talks began between the United States and Iran separately, which helped to begin to shape the beginnings of an agreement to take care of what looked like and is indeed a first stage effort between the United States, Iran, and the other European and Russian and Chinese negotiating partners for a real approach to dealing with their nuclear program. The deep concern has been that Iran would develop through its civil program such capabilities as to permit it in very rapid time to move rapidly to provide the fissile material for the use in nuclear weapon and thereby escape the kinds of commitments and controls that it had accepted under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The effort of the first stage agreement was to put a cap on that and roll it back. And in fact, indeed, the deepest concern on the part of non-Iranians who are working on non-proliferation has been the fact that Iran had produced some significant amount of material, almost 200 kilograms of 20% enriched material, which would have allowed it perhaps to have a more rapid breakout than we would like or was comfortable with. And the first stage agreement has rolled that back and done many more things. I'll ask Jim to go through that with you from his perspective, because his technical detail on that particular issue I think will help to reassure you. But I would say this, that if you had taken a poll among people watching Iran from the perspective of its nuclear program 3 months before the final negotiations were completed on November 24th, and if you had said the shape of the final agreement will be as it has been, I suspect no more than 3% would have supported that prediction. I would tell you without doubt that this particular agreement got pretty much everything we could have thought of to put in an initial agreement with respect to the interests of the United States and its negotiating partners. We gave very little in return. We gave temporary sanctions relief with no adjustments of the principal institutions or the major sanctions. So this process is a very important one. The next stage, as you all know, will be to create a comprehensive agreement, hopefully the final stage in the nuclear negotiations with Iran, a stage that will be very important because, in effect, it will order the question of a domestic Iranian peaceful program in the context of extra inspections to prevent rapid breakout and at the same time begin to relieve Iran of the burden of sanctions. This is not the end, of course, of the whole process. If it proceeds positively and well, we can see more opportunities down the road, particularly arrangements and agreements over areas where we have had differences and where we have had common views. Afghanistan and Iraq represent places where we have shared more common views with Iran than we have shared differences, and it will be important to see the process move ahead. On the 20th of January, sanctions relief will start, but even more important, Iranian compliance with the agreement will continue. And why do I say continue? Because as early as August, we saw real indications that Iran had already begun to roll back its nuclear program in anticipation of the agreement coming into force. I think now the final question I want to address, and I'll do so briefly, is the fact that in the American Congress, there is still huge distrust of Iran. And there is an effort among many who felt, in fact, that the sanctions were the sole reason why Iran has come to the negotiating table, that we should, rather than to continue with the negotiating process, continue only with the sanctions process. And I have to tell you, I think this is the most unwise move that we could make at the present time. Jim will cover this in more detail, but it is clear that a fundamental basis for the current agreement is no new sanctions. And a fundamental basis for the agreement now before the Congress is not sanctions in 6 months. It's sanctions right away, with the president having a very limited waiver authority to set those aside. So we are, in effect, moving in a direction where if this particular legislation goes through, it will countervene and, in my humble view, destroy the negotiating process that's been brought along so far, as well as the new opportunities to negotiate further. Let me now turn to Jim, who will then fill in all the holes I've left in the program and answer all your questions. Thank you.
Well, first, let me say how happy I am to be here. You know, Tom and I visit a lot of World Affairs Councils, council-like organizations. We've done a lot of events over time, and this is just a fabulous and fantastic event, and you should be very proud of your group and proud of your fantastic leadership. This stuff doesn't happen on its own. It happens because people put hard work into it. And Colorado Springs may not be the biggest city in the world, but you're overperforming, you're outperforming your size with the sort of events that you have today. I mean, please. And you see the fruits of that in that young speaker we had. I mean, it's not every teenager who has Secretary General in their title. You know, frankly, I'm a little jealous of that. But, I'm here, I'm happy to be here too because I've been here before. Been to Colorado Springs, been in this beautiful hotel. My daughter attended CU at Boulder, so I'm thrilled to be back. And I'm thrilled in particular to be here today. Today, rather than a week from now. If I appeared a week from now after my New England Patriots had beaten the Denver Broncos, yes, it's okay to boo the speaker. It's okay. So with my obligations taken care of, I want to spend just a couple of minutes and talk about Iran's nuclear status and then talk about the agreement. So let's begin with Iran's nuclear program, the facts. And it's a confusing issue. People throw around words like nuclear program, nuclear weapons program, make all sorts of statements. Most of them are not very well grounded. In fact, I guess we should be used to that as part of the national political dialogue. But I think it makes sense to step back and be very specific about where we're at and what we're talking about. And for me, I use two sources for the basis of making conclusions about Iran's nuclear program. One is the International Atomic Energy Agency reports. The quarterly reports come out every 3 months that tell us precisely what Iran's nuclear program is doing, how many centrifuges they have, what are they producing, because the IAEA is at every facility in Iran inspecting those facilities. They are there every week. And then the second, and that gives you the view from, on the ground level in the facility. But then if you step back and look more broadly at the 30,000 feet view, the Rockies view of the Iran program, I rely on the public testimony of the Director of National Intelligence. This is the top U.S. intelligence official in the United States of America. And he has repeatedly testified and has testified this year to the following. This summarizes Iran's nuclear program. First, Iran has a basic nuclear weapons capability. Now, you hear a lot of talk in Congress about our objective should be to stop Iran from getting a capability. The DNI is testifying they already have a basic capability. And why does he say that? He says that because they've built centrifuges. And if you can enrich uranium, and you can enrich it to 3%, you can enrich it to 80% or 90%. And if you bomb them, that's not going to change that. You cannot bomb the knowledge of how to build a centrifuge out of their heads. They are not close to having a nuclear weapon, not close at all, but they have a basic capability. And so when the president says that U.S. policy objective is to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, that reflects the DNI's sense of their current state. But preventing them from having a capability, that horse has left the barn. That's not what this is about. It's about keeping a nuclear weapon away from Iran. The DNI has also testified that Iran had a nuclear weapons program, not a nuclear program, but a nuclear weapons program, a structured nuclear weapons program, sometime from the late 1990s up until 2003, and then the Supreme Leader halted that program in 2003. So when people refer in the present tense to Iran's nuclear weapons program, I don't know what they're referring to, because the program was killed in 2003. According to the top official in U.S. intelligence, publicly at high confidence. The DNI goes on to testify that Iran, while having this basic capability, has not yet made the decision whether to pursue nuclear weapons or not. So this is an open question. They are not currently pursuing nuclear weapons. They could go in either direction, but it's not clear at all that they will become a nuclear weapon state. That's what these agreements are about, is putting them on a track so that we get this one outcome and not another outcome, because the decision has not yet been made. So that's where we are with their nuclear program according to the DNI. And that, you can look that up, you can Google that, you can Google it on your phones right now, and you can find that testimony. It's the annual threat assessment testimony that the DNI gives. So that's sort of where we're at. So the idea behind the agreement, the interim agreement, and hopefully what will be a comprehensive agreement, again, is to take Iran, which hasn't decided its nuclear future, and put it on a track like all the other countries. The nuclear age is filled with countries that started down the path towards nuclear weapons, stopped and reversed course. Now, we all know about the nuclear weapon states, right? India, Pakistan, US, Russia, France, Israel. But we never talk about, unless you're a scholar, you never talk about the countries that started down that path, stopped and pulled back. And while there are 9 nuclear weapon states, there are 30 countries in the history of the nuclear age that started, stopped, and reversed course. So history is actually on our side here. We have a very good track record, far better than anyone would have predicted, at reversing course and having countries not become nuclear weapon states. So this agreement is intended to help do that. So what happened? What did we get in this agreement? Well, we walked into this interim agreement negotiation with number one priority from a non-proliferation standpoint. Our number one priority was to stop 20% enrichment. Now, you can't make a bomb with 20% enriched uranium. You can't make a bomb with 3 to 5%. You need 80 to 90%. But if you have a big pile of 20% sitting around, then that's a proliferation concern, because a state might decide suddenly to grab it, enrich it up to 80%, and then make a bomb. So the number one thing we wanted in this negotiation was no 20% enrichment, and for them to get rid of the 20% they already had. And we got that. That is in the interim agreement. That's being implemented as of today. So we got our number one proliferation concern addressed in that. But it didn't stop there. We got, and I was surprised by this. I think, Tom, you were surprised by this too. We thought we were going to get 20% based on our conversations with the Iranian president and the Iranian foreign minister and the American side. We thought that was going to happen. But I was surprised at what are called, and again, the agreement's online, you can look it up, what are called enhanced monitoring, which is essentially verification. Iran has agreed to allow IAEA inspectors at some facilities to have daily access to sensitive facilities, right? There is no country in the world, in the international system, in the non-proliferation treaty that has that level of intrusive inspection. None. So that's a pretty big win. And we're now able to have access to Iran's centrifuge production facilities and to their uranium mines. In other words, up the stream, which we never had access before, not for more than 10 years. And now we have access to that. So in any number of different ways, there are commitments in this agreement that really pull Iran back. It's not, if they wanted to throw out all the inspectors and try to make a dash for the bomb, that'd be possible. But of course, we would know they were doing it because the inspectors would be kicked out. So this is quite I think, a substantial achievement on the non-proliferation side for us in this first part. Now, what did Iran want in the agreement? They wanted sanctions relief. That was their number one issue. And in particular, they wanted, like we wanted nuclear and we got 20%, they wanted sanctions relief, and they wanted relief from oil sanctions, banking sanctions, and financial sanctions. And this agreement gave them none of that, right? None. They got some petrochemical relief, some gold and hard currency, some auto parts. They got $4 billion. There's been a lot of loose talk about the U.S. is giving them $4 billion. That's not true. That's another misrepresentation. This is $4 billion that they had been paid for goods and services that they had rendered that was sitting in European banks. This is their money. But we froze it so they couldn't get their money out of the banks in Europe. So now they get to have access to their money, their own money. So, we didn't give a lot for what we got our number one priority. They did not get their number one priority. Now, come the final agreement, both sides, this is going to have to be a reciprocal arrangement in which all sides get what they need. So their issues are going to have to be addressed. But at least in the interim agreement, we got a lot more than I think I certainly expected and that other people thought. The main thing we promised, when you read the agreement, the main thing we promised in this interim agreement was no additional sanctions. No additional sanctions. And so, as Tom says, as we think about what I think about the threats to a negotiated settlement and putting us on a path to avoid war and to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon at some point in the future, there are several dangers. There are hardliners in Iran that would love to undercut this president and see that negotiation fail. And we have hardliners here who would love to undercut the president and see that negotiation fail. And the main instrument for that is this sanctions bill in Congress, this sanctions bill right here, which I've read every line of all 52 pages. This bill imposes new sanctions. Now, you may be saying to yourself, Jim, wait, Congress has done such a great job on domestic policy with the budget. Shouldn't we let them unilaterally intervene into an international negotiation? And I hear you on that. But the president opposes it. This bill is offered in support of the negotiation. but the president has opposed it. The DNI, the top intelligence official of the United States, has said that if that passes, it will undermine the negotiations. And our negotiating partners, the people that we've already made promises to, the British, the French, the Germans, don't want this and said they're not imposing sanctions and they don't want to see it undercut. This is not a U.S.-Iran deal. This is an international deal, and Congress is sticking its fingers in the middle of an international negotiation. And frankly, I think if you read the deal, it's hard to read this legislation, it's very hard not to conclude that this is not about supporting negotiations. This is not even about sanctions leverage. This is about killing the deal, outright killing it. Half this bill, which is called the Iran nuclear-free bill, is not about nuclear at all. And Iran does a lot of bad things, right? There are human rights issues and there are relations with Hamas and Hezbollah. I don't like any of that. But this is, our national security priority, the one for Israel, the one for our allies in the region, is nuclear weapons. And of course, if we start down this path, I guess Iran can turn around and say, well, we're not going to sign a nuclear deal until you stop NSA surveillance and, return people from Guantanamo or whatever. That's the road to ruin. That's the road to a dead negotiation. But if we're trying to rein in the potential future nuclear weapon in Iran, the only way you're going to do that is through negotiation. We've made tremendous progress. People didn't think this interim agreement would be finalized for another 10 days, 2 weeks. It got done early. Not a lot of foot dragging, not a lot of playing for time. No, everyone is moving fast on this. And so I think we have to give the negotiators a chance to be successful. If there aren't, we'll impose new sanctions, we'll do what has to be done, but let's not kill the baby in the crib. And that's what I see as the chief threat to a peaceful resolution of this issue right now. That and those in Iran. But I've spoken for too long, and I've endorsed the Pats over the Broncos, so let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a lot of good time for questions, about a half an hour. Yes? So two-part question. How did you define rapid breakout? And the second one is that there is a modification to that uranium that's been enriched to 20%. And could you elaborate further on what specifically happens to that? And I guess the real issue, is it recoverable?
Yeah. Those are both terrific questions, excellent questions. Let me take them one at a time. First, the issue of breakout. Where do I begin? I've addressed this question so many times I forgot where I'm supposed to start.
At the beginning.
So at the beginning. So traditionally breakout, this is a poor basis for defining it, but breakout is defined as the ability for a country to acquire one standard quantity, SQ, of highly enriched uranium, which would be enough for one bomb. Now, it's a sort of a funny standard because as a student of nuclear weapon states, there's no nuclear weapon state whose goal is to build one bomb, right? Because then you test it and what? You don't have anything. So most states, they usually go for 6, 8, 10, or in the case of the US and the Soviet Union, tens of thousands. But in any case, the standard definition, for whatever reasons, is one standard quantity of highly enriched uranium or plutonium that would be enough to build one bomb. Ultimately, of course, as long as Iran is producing 3 to 5%, in theory, it could continue to enrich 3 to 5%, up to 80% bomb-grade uranium. And how long it takes depends on a couple of variables that we can't specify right now. How many centrifuges do you have? Are they advanced centrifuges or are they the P1 centrifuges? To what level are you enriching? All those things affect the timeline. Here's what I say is the important issue about this. The Secretary of Defense of the United States and the people I talk to in the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission say that from the day that Iran decides that it wants to have a nuclear weapon, it will take them about a year. A year. Now, why is that? Because producing fissile material, either highly enriched uranium or plutonium, is only the first start. Then you have a pile of material. Then you have to fashion it into a weapon, and then you have to fashion that warhead such that it can be, normally the way this works is you start out big. Crude warheads are big warheads, and then as you get more sophisticated, they get smaller. So if you're going to build a missile and put a warhead on it, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of work. And this isn't just any work, right? You can afford no errors when it comes to nuclear weapons. You cannot afford for it to go off prematurely. You cannot afford to send a missile up and have it come down, right? So the tolerances here are unbelievable. So I'm sure our military cadets understand this, that when we use the phrase militarily reliable weapon, we're talking about a standard that is not an industrial standard. And so that is why the Israeli Atomic Energy Agency Commission I've spoken with, the Secretary of Defense, and others say, from the moment they decide, it will take them about a year. Now, at the point in which they decide that, they're going to have to send the inspectors home, because the inspectors will catch them right away as they try to repipe the centrifuges. So we will know almost instantly if they've decided to break out. And of course, by that point, if they decide to break out, I don't think the U.S. is just going to sit on its hands. I don't think Israel is going to sit on its hands. So, and I think the Iranians know that, right? So it doesn't carry strong logic. Let's back up and put it in a historical context. This program has been around since the mid-1980s. It's 2014, right? This is not a race to the bomb. And as the DNI has testified, they have not yet made a decision to develop nuclear weapons. That's what's up for grabs. But I can tell you this, in the absence of an agreement, that nuclear program will expand because there'll be no constraints on it. There'll be no limits, and we won't have the verification that we have under the agreement. They'll continue with the Arak reactor, they'll continue enriching, they'll continue 20%. Remember that chart that Netanyahu had at the UN with in the shape of a bomb with a fuse on top? Some of you might have seen his speech at the UN, and sort of the red level. What this agreement does by taking the 20% away is it drops that line down. It drops his line down. Now, as far as reconstitution on the 20%, excellent question. I think yes. If they can dilute the 20% down to 3 to 5%, they're going to do with about half of that, and the other half they're going to fashion into fuel plates that would be used as fuel in a research reactor. But if they wanted to, they could, for the other half that they watered down, re-enrich it up. And for the fuel plates, it's more of a challenge, but there's nothing in principle that would prevent them from then sort of reversing the process. But it would be a little hairy. But in principle, they could do it. But it's not about that. It's about creating confidence and deterrence that they would ever even consider that in the first place. That would be my view.
Let me do a quick follow-up on that, because it's something that you alluded to, but maybe get beyond it. One of the things that I think is the motivation for the Senate legislation is, well, if sanctions helped us get us here, then more sanctions must be better. So I guess the real question is, and we don't have a definitive answer, but I think maybe the two of you have at least as good an insight as any. What is the motivation beyond getting out from underneath sanctions for Iran to do this deal? They must have an interest in this. Is it just the sanctions, or is it something broader, more systemic about wanting a different relationship?
I want Tom to take that, but I can't help but want to intervene at the beginning and say, for those of you who are taking medication, I suggest you do not use the principle, oh, I'm taking enough and it works, I guess I'll just take more. That's normally not considered a healthy thing.
It'll work faster, but in a different direction.
Yeah.
I think that if you go back and look at facts, what was the platform that Rouhani ran on to win the last election, which started a process which led to the negotiations? Well, his platform was, we want to be part of the international community. We're tired of being isolated. We would like to play a role. We're tired of being separated. And indeed, some of the effect of the policies pursued by the United States and its allies, in addition to sanctions alone, were to seek to find a way to separate Iran from the international community, where they were doing things we didn't like, they were engaged in programs we were concerned about. It made a lot of sense. So there is a reason to move ahead here that I think needs to be tested. And anyone who believes that you would set aside a negotiating process that has made this kind of progress, and the door to which was opened yesterday to the next stage of negotiations, hopefully be able to make similar kinds of progress in 6 months or beyond, if necessary, in favor of either having Iran make a bomb or go to war over that subject, has really got to have its values and his principles and ideas examined somewhere. And our hope is, through discussion with people like you and elsewhere, we can at least raise the question, because the alternative here is either we test out where we can go, and I think lose nothing by it in terms of the advantages we now have. And if that fails, then we're stuck with the bad alternatives. But if it succeeds, then we avoid the bad alternatives.
Question. Brent. The first part of the question, does the rolling back of the enrichment include the inspections include the Fordo plant? And the second part?
At Iraq, they're building a plutonium production reactor. Is that also being
In Iraq?
It's,
Okay. I missed
Yeah,
it. I was
it's
about to say, I'm trying to get it. In Iraq, ARAK, they're building a plutonium
Right.
reactor. It's gotten a lot of news lately.
So-
is that a part of this process?
Yes. So on the first question, the Fordo facility, which is underground, under several hundred feet of rock, that facility, which has about 3,000 centrifuges, has always been under IAEA inspection. Every quarterly report, they report what goes on there, and it will continue to be under IAEA inspection, only under enhanced inspection going forward. So always has been under this agreement, always will be, but more so. As to the Iraq reactor, back in August, before we even started this negotiation, with the new team in place, they had already started to signal a willingness to move on some of these issues, right? No negotiations, not till, November, September? So in August, the August IAEA report in that report, it said that the Iranians had announced that the Iraq reactor, which is a heavy water reactor, the original date for it to come online was supposed to be midsummer 2014. And even prior to the negotiation, they were announcing that they were pushing off that startup date. And under the agreement, they've agreed not to do any major construction related to the functioning of the reactor. They can do construction at the reactor site, but they're not going to do anything that substantively advances the progress of the reactor. The other thing I might want to point out, and I don't want to, the Iraq reactor has been quite a topic of some conversation in the past several months. If you have a heavy water reactor, and I hate heavy water reactors, by the way, I hate them, but if you have them and you're using them as a path to the bomb, the reactor is not enough. You need a reprocessing plant, right? Because the idea is the reactor runs, it burns up its fuel at a high level, and there's a high content of plutonium in the fuel. Well, you can't make a bomb out of that. Anyone who goes through that's going to be fried in a heartbeat. So what you have to do is take that nuclear waste and then reprocess it, recycle it, which means to extract the plutonium from the other actinides and the other nasty bits that are in the waste. So you need a reprocessing plant. They do not have a reprocessing plant. They have zero reprocessing plant. They haven't finished the reactor. They have no reprocessing plant. And they have said that they will not build a reprocessing plant. So, I think it's worth keeping an eye on. I think it's an issue that we have to address in the comprehensive agreement. But frankly, I'm more focused on the centrifuges that are producing enriched material every month, right? Rather than some theoretical thing that hasn't actually started up yet. I think we need to get our arms around the centrifuges and the production of enriched uranium. I don't know if this analogy works. I've tried it several times. I think it's failed every time I've used it. But so let's give it another try. If you've been shot once, if you've been killed and shot dead, the second time you shoot the guy doesn't really matter that much, right? So, yeah, I worry about Iraq, but I'm more a little focused on the centrifuges.
Could I just add to Jim's point, with Iraq, we have time, and there are technical processes that could be applied there, which makes it not the ideal plutonium producer. And there are agreements which could be made that if it is used, as they say, to make medical isotopes, that could be kept under careful control, and the fuel containing plutonium shipped out. There are any number of useful things that could be done under the present set of arrangements that we would look forward to in the comprehensive agreement.
The question is, where is the disconnect? Why, given this argument, which is a different argument than one often hears instead of in this debate, is what is it about the 50, what don't the 59 senators that are sponsoring the legislation get? What is the counter argument? Why are they doing this? Because it's obviously got to be more than Republicans.
Jim and I have spent a lot of time on the Hill, and he'll give you his view. My view is that many of the people who are influenced by this were influenced by the first descriptions of the agreement by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who obviously had no clear idea about what the agreement actually provided for, but had a clear idea of what he didn't want and described it in those terms. And you will notice that several weeks afterward, that stopped. And the view shifted around toward what can we do now with respect to the agreement, based, in my view, on absolute mistrust of Iran and a clear sense that things like statements made by President Ahmadinejad during his period in power in Iran about demonizing Israel and denying the Holocaust were in fact the true expression of all Iranian government and other views. I think that's now subject to question, but that hasn't come through. So large numbers of senators, I think, feeling very strongly about their commitments to Israel and the danger they see Israel in, and the concerns that the Israeli government has conveyed to them, he believes that this particular bill that Jim has shown you here is the correct answer to that particular problem. It is contained in an approach that comes on two levels. One approach is we're really here to help you, President Obama, by passing more sanctions sometime down the road if Iran misbehaves, so that in fact you can have this in your pocket and it can keep pressure on. The really interesting thing is to read the bill, because I think, and Jim, I think you were the first to say this, we found that large numbers of senators and their staffs that we talked to had not read the bill, had no real
I know, it's shocking.
idea
Shocking.
what was in the bill. And so that's contributed to it. But Jim, pick it up from there.
No, I think that that's right. So first, let's characterize the nature of where we're at on this. So all but two Republican senators have become co-sponsors. I'm terrible with names, but the guy from Kentucky, Rand Paul, and one other, and Flake, Senator Flake. So all the Republicans, the Democrats, 13 Democrats have co-signed the bill. I think some of them probably with good intentions, thinking that they were supporting the president in the negotiation, but maybe had not read the bill. That's just the honest truth. And I would encourage you, in a debate as now partisan, but in any case complicated and difficult as the Iran debate, you can download the bill. You can go to thomas.gov, which is the place where all U.S. congressional bills are. It's Senate S, is for Senate, S 1881. Download the bill, read it, and then you'll be able to tell whether we're making this up or whether someone else is making it up.
It's not nearly as long as the Affordable Care Act, right?
And I would say we have to be honest here. There's intense political lobbying involved in this. Very, very intense. Some organizations are having high school students call into offices. So this touches a lot of buttons, and people have very strong views on it. So I think there's some confusion, and then other people are not confused. Other people are very clear about what their intentions are.
Some are saying that they support the bill, but they would not vote to overturn a presidential veto. So there are nuances here. I never saw a senator who didn't believe that it wasn't important to be registered on both sides of an issue if it could be done without harm. And I have great faith in your senators, but I think that they all, obviously one time or another, have had opportunities to vote for one version of a bill and then to vote against another version of the bill. So some of that is at play in this particular issue. And for many of them, it's very important. After all, we're approaching what? An election year.
Yeah. And I want to say that Tom and I have we've met now with dozens of congressional offices, mostly Senate offices, and senators. probably more than a dozen. I don't know what the count is, Iris, how many senators? Yeah. 45 offices and probably 20 or more senators individually. And I can tell you behind closed doors, they are telling us that they are under tremendous political pressure.
Got a hand over here. Yes, ma'am. Why in addition to Israel, Saudi Arabia and Jordan have both been particularly opposed to this, and why?
Let me say that they have been very concerned that Iran, as a result of the negotiations, and it's not the bill they're unhappy about the agreement, the joint plan of action, because they believe that this is the opening to the door of some U.S. effort to put Iran in some kind of preeminent place in the Middle East as the kind of what the Shah wanted to be, cock of the walk, the arbiter of things in the Middle East. I think we have absolutely no intention of doing that. I would suspect that Iranians would love to be there if they could, but I think they have a clearer idea of what the realities are. But it's this deep sense that somehow we're taking this whole group of our present harem, if I can use that word, and ready to exchange it for an Iranian beauty somewhere down the road in a new kind of marriage in the region. And so that's added to concerns and jealousies. They have been concerned over the years by several aspects of Iranian behavior, which is a legitimate sense of concern. The Iranians have promoted Shia ascendancies, or they have promoted Shia demonstrations, outbreaks, appearances of solidarity in places like eastern Saudi Arabia. There are very few Shia in Jordan, but there are Shia in the neighborhood, particularly in Iraq. And so there is the Sunni-Shia contest, which has gone on since the 9th century, which indeed is a problem for difficulties. There is the Persian-Arab problem. If you go to Iran and begin a discussion, they're concerned about Arabs as being gentlemen who recently have gotten down from their camels, as opposed to 2,500 years of regal history in Iran is very real. And I have to tell you that the same kind of affection is demonstrated on the other side of the barrier. There are concerns about Iranian buildup, about the war between Iraq and Iran as being a life or death struggle between Arabs and Persians for control of the Gulf and the oil resources. So there's a long history of differences that is playing out now, and I think will continue to play out, and it makes it very difficult to go through a process of change in Iran, while at the same time assuring our Arab friends that we have no intention of feeding what I would call the appetites of those who would, in fact, want to become Iranian dinosaurs in the region.
Let me just briefly add that, in simple terms, Saudi Arabia and Iran are rivals, right? For a variety of reasons, some good reasons, some bad reasons. But this is a regional rivalry. It has nothing to do with us. The second thing I would say is, for reasons alluded to when I talked about the sanctions bill, Iran and the U.S. are not, let's say we settle the nuclear issue. We're not going to become best buddies. They're not Sweden. We're still going to have differences over human rights and terrorism and Hamas and Hezbollah. And we're going to have lots of differences. But our differences didn't stop the Soviet Union and the United States from working out arms control agreements. The rivalry between communist China and the United States did not stop us from working out arms control agreements. With Gaddafi, with whom we had an arms control agreement that took away his nuclear assets. The fact that we weren't pals didn't stop that. So I don't think we're suddenly going to all jump in bed together and the Arabs are going to be left in the cold. But I do think that there's a middle range here that no one talks about. And that is, we're not going to be best buddies, but there are things where we do have common interests, right? In Iraq, Iran wants the current government of Iraq to succeed. It wants stability in Iraq. It doesn't want a sectarian war. We support the government in Iraq. We want stability. We don't want to see a sectarian war. In Afghanistan, we're pulling out. Now, do we want to see a return to the Taliban? No, we do not. Does Iran want to see a return to the Taliban? No, it does not. On Syria, they're backing the other guy. We're back. It's not, we're not backing Assad. We're on different sides of the fence here. But neither of us wants to see chemical weapons in Syria, and both of us wish this civil war would stop because it is a path to a contagious sectarian war that could engulf the region. So, they're not going to be Britain, but we have areas in the region where we have common interests, and change in the nuclear may create the possibility for dialogue about other issues and the possibility for greater stability in the Middle East.
Let me just pick it up there very briefly, because this is an extremely important question. It would be worthwhile to read what the Saudis said in their initial reaction to the agreement of November 24th, the first nuclear agreement. They were quite positive, very interesting. The Saudis have learned that in their part of the world, they do not seek fights. They, however, have been in private to us deeply concerned that we are going to shift the whole balance. So the problem for diplomats is you turn challenges into opportunities. Is there a way, and I've thought for a long time about this, that in Iraq we can work with the Shia government to open up more understanding about the Sunni minority, which used to be the ruling majority of the ruling government inside a majority country. To some extent, there is this constant battle for majority rule, minority rights that has to be worked out. It's not part of what I would call the tradition in that part of the world. But each of these countries has that burden to bear, including Iran, which is heavily populated by minorities. So this, over a period of time, is the kind of direction. Syria is replete with this. And so we have lots of interesting challenges in the Middle East. It doesn't mean, in effect, that we have to fasten ourselves to one set of people only or to one set of ideas. We're in an interesting possibility now of seeing whether we can, as Secretary Kerry has been trying to do, work out some balances.
Yes, Owen. Excellent question. Of the, I think it's 30 countries that have moved down the path towards nuclear weapons and then turned around 180 degrees, what has happened to their material?
Yeah, it's a good question. Now, when I talk about 30, this has been over the course of the nuclear age, so roughly from 1950 through now. So some of those countries started down the path, started programs, but didn't end up building facilities. Some built facilities, but then just then rendered them to be purely civilian facilities without enrichment or reprocessing. So there's a continuum here of where states have gone. To sort of speak to what you're raising, which I think is the issue of fissile material security, right? How do we make sure that if there is material that might be used for nuclear weapons, that it doesn't fall into the hands of terrorists or other non-state actors or elsewhere? We faced that challenge most especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But to name 3 states that had nuclear weapons assets that gave them up and that pose issues for nuclear fissile material security would have been Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, all formerly part of the Soviet Union that became independent states that had lots of nuclear weapons facilities and nuclear material in those countries. And then the U.S. and others face the challenge of how do we secure this material before someone with evil intention is able to steal it, through corruption or whatever. And I must say that this has been a real policy victory. Sam Nunn and George Shultz and others made this a big priority. The retired senator from Indiana, Senator Lugar. And we have, in fact, the Nuclear Threat Initiative just this week released a report card. Again, you can download it if you go to nti.org, a report card about our progress we've made in securing this material. We've done a tremendous job. Now, when you're swimming in nuclear material, again, most of it in the former Soviet Union, and all you need is a softball-sized unit of highly enriched uranium, you have a lot of work to do. But I would call this a public policy success, and we've made big strides. And on the 3 states that I mentioned, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus, I think in most cases we've been able to just outright remove the material.
Could you say, spend just a few seconds on South Africa, which actually gave up weapons and is
Right.
really kind of the extreme case?
South Africa was a nuclear weapon state. It produced, 8 nuclear devices, I think it is, and then dismantled. It actually started the process of giving up its nuclear weapons before the transition to Mandela, before the white government gave up power, and then invited the International Atomic Energy Agency in, and they oversaw dismantlement and certified them as having no fissile material. So that also points to the absolutely critical role that the International Atomic Energy Agency has. You know, states are the most important actors in the international system. I think we have to say that. Sorry, model UN guys. States are still the most important actor. But in the 20th century has witnessed, in ways that no one could have predicted, the importance of international agencies like the IAEA. And one of the reasons why we've had the success we've had, why nonproliferation is, I consider, the biggest public policy success of the 20th century, is that we've been able to create agencies and understandings and safeguards and arrangements that have helped to make that happen, and they've played a critical role.
We've got time for one. We can try one more question, but could you say that last part again, because I missed it?
I can repeat the question.
Okay, you got it?
I'd like to have the
His
two of
ears are
you
better than mine.
elaborate a little more on why you have been saying Iran has an alignment with us on Afghanistan. I think principal points to make here is that the Taliban opposition in Afghanistan is Sunni. There is a Shia minority in the center of Afghanistan called the Hazara. The Iranians have traditionally supported groups in Afghanistan who have opposed the Taliban for obvious reasons. The Iranians are deeply concerned by drug trafficking from Afghanistan going along and through its borders. The Iranians have made the case that they have lost 3,000 people in the struggle against the drug traffickers from Afghanistan, and would very much like to see that stopped. We have, as a matter of concern to me, found it almost impossible to stop drug cultivation and trafficking in Afghanistan in large measure because we have always believed it would add rapidly to the recruitment for the Taliban. But it is at one and the same time a source of income from the Taliban. So it gives you that consternating problem that you face in a situation like Afghanistan. So I think those are the roots of some of the belief. Similarly, as Jim said, in Iraq, with a Shia majority government, not dominated by Iran, but with close ties. After all, during the 8-year war, the majority of the Arab army fighting Iran were Shia Arabs. But nevertheless, there is a common view that Iraq and Afghanistan are part of the security perimeter of Iran. And as a result, anything that can bring about common views helps. There was no question at all in our early period of invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranians and indeed the Revolutionary Guard provided help to us in dealing with that particular problem. So I think those are the bases for our feelings that there is an opening and a possibility, and the Iranians themselves keep saying so.
And I would just add quickly 2 more things. You'll remember that when the Taliban was in charge in Afghanistan, I may have the exact number wrong, but I believe they took, was it 18? No. Some number of Iranian diplomats.
8 in
yeah.
Mazar-e Sharif.
Took them hostage. I think they ended up murdering them.
They killed them
all. So the Taliban, Iran, murdering diplomats sort of crosses the line.
Crosses my line.
And then the other thing, and Tom touched on it, was not only the waging the war itself, but the peace in Afghanistan. The current foreign minister Zarif, was there at the Bonn conference when all the parties were trying to establish a new government in Afghanistan, and what eventually became the Karzai government. And at the end of the day, Jim Dobbins, who works for the U.S. government, was there then working for the U.S. government negotiating this deal and is now back in Afghanistan. He's written extensively about this after a period at RAND. He will tell you that it was the Iranians who delivered the votes for the Karzai government.
And cadets particularly will be interested to know that in the beginning of our military action into Afghanistan after 9/11, it was with respect to that collaboration, is that our pilots understood that if something happened to them, they needed to go someplace. Last time you look at a map, Afghanistan is landlocked, was to head west because they'd be picked up and taken care of. We often forget that in the as we tend to simplify a world that defies simplification. And on that note, I want to ask all of you to join me in thanking Ambassador Tom Pickering and Dr. Jim Walsh